당도 가서 녀모바 탐지 진한 주게 동아야야게 규제 조어디 가르치는 것은 녀모발레인데 용거리에서 단 녀모바디게 내야 제비 주세 규제 가르치는 다세 마리 파사야 될 이거래서 제산다 다세 마리 파사야 돼 빠야디 디 도초게 녀보 아니 동유도 베셔라도 콤발레티네 방고거래서 되네 자다 동유도 베셔라 콤고래서 제가 동유도 베셔라 콤바나 다 동이세도 유 동유도 베셔라 유 동반이디다 아주 마인가레베 메가레 주바레스네 안데니기 디숨나네 가르엘람나다 메가레스 자다 주바마에 마인가라 마인스네 온두스네 가산디 고마 아주 디슈바시.
Good morning. And last night then we looked once again at the reason why it is essential to cultivate the wisdom that realizes emptiness, consciousness that understands reality. And this is because all the suffering, pain and anguish that we experience is experienced due to our afflictions. And these afflictions themselves come from a cause. And their root cause is the ignorance of self-grasping. And the ignorance of self-grasping apprehends reality in a way that it does not exist. So therefore, the antidote to this ignorance is the wisdom that does apprehend reality correctly. And this is the wisdom realizing emptiness. And thereafter, we looked at the object of that wisdom, emptiness, whether between the two, positive and negative phenomena, that it is a negative phenomenon, and amongst the two divisions of negative phenomenon, it is not an affirming negation, but a non-affirming negation. So that we looked at last night.
동반이디 안에 많이 가던 주바 있나 안에 가르치기래라네 안델이야 안에 가르치 용거에서네 안에 아직 동반이 또 별로디 안에 된지 아까서 템버주 바집에 예 직진줘야기 냥아치 괜지 용거에서나 되네 안에 지금 되네 된지 동반이 공비게 된신지 가토 말에서 직대 되네 동반이 또 별로디 된지 녀보 책이 말에서 직제 되네 된지 동반이 공발에 되네 디버봉투 말에서 되네 인자 다가지 동반이디 마인가던 주바 있나 동반이 또 별로디 된진 차로 그래서 그러 다고 된지 있나 되네 녀모베 녀보치 투 말에 녀모베 녀보치 마도 녀모바투 말에서 다 괜찮아 디용 그래 되네 인자 괜되네 용구요 반자 다 동반이 세디 메가 가자 가점지마도 안에 가야 최신 평규어 말에서 메가래서
Also last night, we looked at the faults that would follow if emptiness were either a positive phenomenon or an affirming negation. And those faults would be then, if emptiness were a positive or affirming negation, the consequences would be that the wisdom that realizes such an emptiness would actually enhance our grasping at true existence. So enhancing our grasping at true existence, being the first consequence, leads to the second, which that the wisdom realizing emptiness, or such an emptiness, could not be an antidote to our ignorance, because it enhances the grasping at true existence. And the third consequence would be, not being an antidote to the root cause of all suffering, it could not, therefore, eliminate the obscurations. So those are the three consequences that would follow were emptiness to be either an affirming negation or a positive phenomenon. But emptiness is not an affirming negation because to be an affirming negation, something is negated, but something is also implied. Whereas emptiness is the mere lack of the object of negation. Nothing is implied. Therefore, it is a non-affirming negation.
자, 안데니게 나 지게 가상한저 싱 익스베 탕랍나 주바체 탕랍나 주바체 제가 가서 탕라도 탕코로마도 가는 고고마 탕라는 주바 탕 매발랍잖아 탕 매발라도 탕 매바고 매바코롱 고야마도 신이 가야 고고 말와 탕 매바세야 되려면도 탕 매바디 구구마다 탕 까베 까섬 동바디 구구마다 현재 가야 로리바 직 리고 말해 탕 라요도 탕 매발라는 매가자로 그래서네 탕 매발라요도 탕 매바디 파 여바디까지 매바디 고마도 현대 가야 구구마 로디기 지산 탕 매발라는 매가자자 나 신매비 탕 랍자베나 가르고고세 니구고래 신매바 세디 당고 신여바디 파까 대대 탕세 고 니구고래 지세 신매비 탕라네 많이 가자로 그래 나 대대게 탕 랍샤나 탕라네 호라 지부 랍샤나 탕 랍나 탕세디 두바샤서 탕세디 지 여바지 구고마도 매바당 가니까 구고마 여바지 구고로 봐 지산 탕 랍네 두바래 신매비 탕라네 많이 가래 지나시 때 신 가서 탕 매바 랍잖아 아니 탕 매바세네 많이 매가 자르고 봐 진짜 디 과탕한테 탕 매바라도 탕 여바데 바까지 매바 호롱 똥 똥바디 고알마도 생각하야 그거 말아 탕 매바라는지 매가 자르고 그래 진짜다 신 매비 탕라도 신 매바디고 디슈라 안에 가르고서 탕도 여바데 고용 거래 진짜 신 매비 탕라는 많이 가르죠 다 탕 랍잖아 그런 여바지 공부도 가자 가야 가고 말이지 탕라네 주바래 지사데 탕 매바 신매비 탕 랍샤네 디 숨디레도 직 매가 직 마인가 직 주바 자 책도와
Because this terminology is quite alien, it's good then perhaps to revise or re-look at the illustration I gave last night of the three phenomena, positive, and then affirming negation and non-affirming negation. So if we take the statement, a plain without trees, or there's a plain without trees, or a plain with no trees, then look at various parts of that. If we were just to say a plain, or there is a plain, that is a positive phenomenon. So that is a positive phenomenon. Merely saying a plain, then that is a positive phenomenon. And if we were to then say there is no plain, then that would be a negation. Something is negated. And of the two types of negations, it's a non-affirming negation because nothing is being implied. There is no plain. So this is a negation because there's a negative word, no, so something is negated, but nothing is implied. So no plain is an illustration of a non-affirming negation, whereas stating plain, it's the word plain itself, or saying there is a plain, that then is a positive phenomenon. And then, if we were to say, the plain is without trees. So here, we have a negation. Something is being negated, we have the word without, so that there's something or we could say a plain that has no trees. So there's something negated. Trees has been negated. But something else is affirmed, and that is plain. Your mind is led to something else, and that is the plain. So an illustration then of an affirming negation is this sentence, a plain without trees, or a plain where there are no trees.
Loma maybe medo said. Loma medican medo labna, Loma maybe medo lido, Karaka was Loma yoba de Pakaje, and a medo go to work. Loma maybe medo lana, Mainga charagore. Medo lana, medo di Juba charagore. Medo mindu labna, the medo meva lana, mega charagore. Medo mindu lagodu, medo yoba de Kaj, meva the Goma, Shango Goma, medo mindu meva says. Loma may be medo lagodu, Cargos, Loma yomares, Loma yoba de ka, then medo suko to go, Loma may be medos. Then medo labjana, medo horonchibu gomado, Kaya Kaya de Gugumua, Gagomara, Louis, just a medo, the medo chibu hako to go. Since I didn't medo la chabena, Loma may be medo said, medo meva said, Tinjane, Megada, Maingada, Netuba said, Odusri, Dina in the Chasan Jayoruba.
take another illustration. If we assert that is a flower, then this is a positive phenomenon. We're just stating or establishing something that is a flower. Nothing is being negated, so it's a positive phenomenon. If we say that is not a flower or no flowers, then that something is clearly being negated. There's a negative word no. That is not a flower, there's no flowers. So this is a negative phenomenon, but nothing is being implied by stating no flowers or not a flower. So this is a non-affirming negation. But if we were to say this is a flower without petals, a flower without petals or a flower that has no petals, then something is being negated. We're saying a flower without petals or a flower with no petals. So there it is a negation, and it's petals that are being negated, but something else is being implied or affirmed, and that is the flower. So in this way, we can see that the term flower, or that is a flower, is a positive phenomenon. Or if we say there is no flower, that is not a flower, it's something is negated, or there's no flower, then we're saying something's negated, but nothing is affirmed, so it's a non-affirming negation. But then in the sentence, a flower without petals, then petals is being negated, but flower is being affirmed. So this is an affirming negation.
저기 동반이 거시에다 델리아 동반이의 랑용회에 가상한주 가서는 동반이 세디 메가레스 아니 그 강라가 메가이레 가서는 가소레 가자디 가잠 심마도 고고 말해서 가잠들이에서 다 동반이 세디 랑용회는 강라에 마도 랑용회는 주변 동바디 랑용회는 주바지 동상 동바디 동반이 세리에지로 지나다 동반이 또 별로디 가르고서 강라에 마도 유가를 즉 강사를 삼자 제바이나 강사세 강라에 마도 랑문의 주비기 강사의 민두 선비기 또요도 네 강사 동반이 강사기 된 동반이 두고래 해야지 먼저 가서 동반이 세 디시고로 와다.
With the emptiness being a non-affirming negation, then when the wisdom that realizes emptiness, to such a wisdom, only the pure empty state or emptiness appears. The mind is not led to something else because emptiness is a non-affirming negation. So nothing is, the mind is not led to anything else. So when emptiness is realized of an object, say the person, when it's realized that the person is empty, then what is realized is that the person is empty of being established by way of their own essence or nature. So only emptiness is realized. The mind is not led to anything else. Emptiness is a non-affirming negation.
And in the Zadang, you Delia Dustik, Sunyoda, Dobashili or Kashi, Dobaligor, Dobakreligor, so Tombani Tobulo digi. Gansa 동방이 또 별로 되게 랑문을 주변 동상시 두고 그래서 두고 그렇고 유 동방이 되고 또 랑문을 마주봐 두고 그래 디디고 그래 저래 다 아니 가려서는 동방이 또 로 코롱기 유 동방이 말해 코롱 안에 템바로 인식으로 와서 동방이 또 별로지 동방 유 동방이다 동방도 별로니요로 봐 도바 칼리오스는 동방이 또 로디기 가르 유디 가르도고서 랑신 주변 동바 두고 그래서 이나 동방이 또 별로 코롱 동방이 두고 말아 봐지래 마도 봐서 코롱 때 동방이 템버 주변 랑신 주변 인초 그래서 그래서 코롱 또야디 벤디로 하다 나 저기 가소리 지금 도바 세거래지 도바 수정 어제자 유전 그런 게 그런 도고 말아봐 마도 반자 유전 그런 도비 동이디 동바 덴바 라신 마주바도 도고 그래 디디고 그래서 라신 마주 그런 유디 라신 마주바래라나 디기도 그래서는 동방이 또 로디 그 라신 마주 도고 그러와 제가 라신 마주바 체명해 봐인자 라신 마주바래스나 디기도 이내다 Rashi Madu, Dokan Lokorong, and Rashi to be in Chuguruas. Casano, Korongi, Rashi Madu, Dogo, Marwa, Madovanza, and Korong Rashi to be in Chuguruas, Tombani to be Louis, Tombani, the Rashi Madubari. In a local Rashi Juba de Labna, and Digiruas and Begeda, Dopasili or Regile.
Those engaged in meditation, when they're looking well, many doubts will arise because they're trying to gain a clear understanding, clear realization of reality. So a doubt that may well arise is the object that has been investigated, one has come to see that it is not self-existent, it's not existent from its own side. So for example, the person, the self, is not established by way of its own nature, not self-existent. So it is empty of being established from its own side. There is a wisdom that is realizing emptiness, realizing that the self is empty of existing by way of its own nature. But that realizing wisdom, perhaps it is inherently existent, perhaps it exists by way of its own nature. The object that has been realized to be empty, that is empty of inherent existence. But the realizing consciousness, perhaps that exists by way of its own nature, because there is no wisdom that is realizing it to be empty of inherent existence. So such a doubt may arise, that the consciousness realizing emptiness itself may be inherently existent, although the object that has been realized to be empty, that is empty, and only emptiness appears, but the realizing consciousness, perhaps that exists by way of its own nature, because there is no other consciousness at that moment realizing that consciousness, that realizing consciousness, to be empty.
다 라신 주바 동유도 별로 코로나 라신 마도 또 구구여 봐나 안에 빈 라신 마도 동방이 또 별로디 동방이 동유도 안에 동유도 별로 코로나 라신 마도 또 구구여나 제사다 동방이 또 별로 코로나 라신 마도 또 별로 실리리에서 로šan다 실리 또 고르와 다 로šan다 또 봐라 안 로šan다 대 라신 마도 또 구구여나 되는 봐 줘야요 말했어 제사디 라신 주베 또 요로 돈이 또 투야 민두 가서는 지 코로나 또 별로데 라신 말로 디도 파파는 투야 매봐 줘야 기니 매게 차투 투바 매봐 차로도 제가 라신이 말로 또 요로디 줘야 매봐 차로 투매 차로도 네 되게 삼로스 리고 레제래
The person having such a doubt then would think, I understand that the object, perhaps the self, that's being investigated, one comes to look and find it doesn't exist by way of its own nature, and therefore emptiness is realized. But the realizing consciousness, the wisdom that is now realizing emptiness, perhaps it exists by way of its own nature. I don't really know, because I'm not investigating that. I'm investigating the object, perhaps the self. What about this consciousness? Now, if I were to investigate this consciousness, make it the object, and I'd investigate the consciousness, being the wisdom realizing emptiness, with another consciousness, and realize it that now the object, that wisdom realizing emptiness, to be empty. What about the new investigating consciousness, the new wisdom realizing emptiness? Perhaps it exists by way of its own nature. And then I would need to investigate this consciousness, make it the object, and investigate it with a third consciousness. And in this way, the sequence would be never-ending, continuously needing to investigate each wisdom realizing emptiness to see whether it is established by way of its own nature. This would be never-ending.
Gone Junju lesson, Gangse number Jebai, Namju Dinu, Jujina, Dese Namju Diani, Namju China, Tuba Mes, that did not what some like Jebarson, there wasn't a disungore.
The doubt that meditators may well come to is expressed by Shantideva in the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. So in our text, we are the top of page 20. No, bottom page 21, or the middle of page 21. Whenever one comprehensively analyzes, the analyzer would also be carefully analyzed. At that time, that meticulous analysis would also be thoroughly analyzed. Thus, it would be never-ending. So I've just inserted a word in the last line. Thus, it would never be never-ending.
강세 넘버 제바이 남주 되니 죄제나 세다 제사 강세수 유강양 강게 제 라신 주머로 넘버 제바 죄 넘버 데버 주머로 제베 갑라서다 되네기 제네 라시 유디 랑근원에 주 라신 주바 데버 주바 마주바 제네 도시네 제네 데버 모주바 남 데버 마주바 레샤 선바 하고 그게 남주기 셰럽디소를 강세 넘버를 제바이 남주기서 남주기 넘버를 제바나 지도 넘버이 템바 주바 레마를 제바체네 넘버를 제 넘버 제네 템바 마주바디 통고래서 죄제나 디세 시도 디세 남제 대항니 시도 디세 디니게 넘버 제 파이 동버 템바 주바 민두스니 제바진 통근으로 호롱서 남제 대항니 남제 친나 투메죠 코로나 템바 주마로 제고로 와서 그러다 지선다 코 덴바 주바 레 마레 코 덴바 마주바 인람나 코 덴바 주바 인민 코롱 덴바 주바 인민 제호 제바체 로치고 그래서 로신다 코롱 게 제바지 제두 마레 지선 로šan다 제코 제바체 그래서 난코 제바지 거 로šan다 샤바나 데니게 로šan다 내 제바체 로šan다 샤 그래 데니 로šan다 마도 로 제바체 로도 좋아해매 데 동이 또에 뉴스 코너 레기미도 써다 이제 투메스 죄제 친나 투바메세 투바메 제가 그 제바 지금 로호란 제바 바지지지 제는 뭐네 동이도 별로디 동이 또야기 주스 저기도 와서 디 동이 제바 지금 로디 디로와 제가 코로나 덴바도 제바진 디기 제고 저래 디고 덴바도 제바 디기 제고 디 덴바도 디기 제고 되는 거 좋아야 균형이 좋아야미도 와서 투메차 되는 동방에 또 사야 주스 코로나미도 와서 제가 되네서 녀모가 방토에 주스 책이 말에 상제에 고가라게 말 타바토에 고가라게 말해서 그 돈달에 딜고 거다 그 제가 투매 책도 오세요. 균진에도 오세야지.
Whenever one comprehensively analyzes, the analyzer would also be carefully analyzed. At that time, the meticulous analysis would also be thoroughly analyzed. Thus, it would be never-ending. So the meaning of this doubt is, as I expressed before, that when one investigates an object to see, such as the self or whatever object to see, if it exists in the way that it appears or not, and realizes that it's empty of self-existence, it's empty of existing by way of its own essence or nature, then there's a consciousness that has realized the object to be empty. But what about that realizing consciousness itself? Does it exist by way of its own nature? The object investigated, one has come to see it does not, but what about the investigating consciousness? We would then need to take the analyzer, that investigating consciousness, and make that, from the subject to the object, make that the object that is investigated, and with another consciousness, investigate this consciousness. And we'd come to realize that this consciousness, which is now the object, through another consciousness, we'd realize it is empty of self-existence. But it is now being investigated by a second consciousness. What about that one? This now needs to be investigated. So this sequence then would be endless. And here the person is expressing a doubt that because of the sequence being endless, they will never come to a stable, satisfactory realization of emptiness, which means they will never actually develop the actual antidote to the afflictions, and thereby will never eradicate their afflictions and never attain enlightenment, because they're having to engage in the same meditation with regard to every single object. In this case, one consciousness after another, after another, after another. So how would one spiritually develop? How would one attain freedom when one is having to engage in this one meditation? It will be endless. So this is their doubt and their frustration.
dine tebara sumasoni di sungurwa. Da dine enzada delia lenro di sungurda. Number jeja number jeje na namje lani dimye dimye min. Dimye chirna mige de deanyangan debar jus. Da di lendi sungurda.
And the next verse then is the reply. When that to be analyzed is exhaustively analyzed, the support for that, and I'll just add a word, detailed analysis, no longer exists. Because the support does not exist, it is not produced. That too is proclaimed to be nirvana.
Zanda jeja number jeja na namje lani dinye minxia. Zanda di gar songosne dongba ni jeba che ne yu dongba ni number jeja number jeje na su yu dongba ni la yu de rangxing yu zhu maru jeba sin rangxing zhu minus dongsang do begi lu digi yu la jeba che ga ge xian da ga yo ma resta. Jeja number jeje na namje lani dinye minxia. Zide 다리 디가 송거스는 동반이 제바치는 유동상 또 배고 로디기 동반이 또 로디기 유라 동반이마도 생각해요 말했어. 매반장 될래 남주기 유 동반이 제바치긴 로디 동반이 또 로디 유라 요 말했어. 제바치가 가요 말했어. 담줄래 띠미 민신 띠 제바치 띠 동시 최진기 띠 최진기 가요 말했어. 지나데 동의도 로디 유다 동사진마도 생각해 매바레스 남줄래네 띠미스 다 안다원이 대송šan되거든.
Look at the first two lines. When that to be analyzed is exhaustively analyzed, here, whatever the object may be, the self or whatever it may be, is investigated, and it is realized that despite appearing to exist by way of its own essence, it is empty of existing by way of its own essence. All that appears when emptiness is realized is the pure empty state. So that's the meaning of the first line. The support for that detailed analysis no longer exists. What that means then is because only the pure empty state or emptiness appears, the object that was being investigated does not appear to the wisdom realizing emptiness. All that appears is emptiness. When emptiness is realized, all that appears is emptiness. The object that was investigated, such as the self, does not appear.
아니 유 동방이다 유제 동방이 또 별로 호랑이가 주간에 신내 차상 랑원이 마주봐 차돼 랑원이 마주봐리스 동방이 또유 동방이 대다 동방이 또유 유제 동방이 또 별로 호랑 랑원이 마주봐리스 라신이 고 랑원 자원이 좀 많이 와지리스 팀메 미기데스 제가 미교받는 대한양은 대버지 시디 디네자 유 동방이다 유제 최간에 랑원이 당번의 랑원의 좀 많이 봐자 랑원 또 동상 동이 되라 민가로서 라신이 양태스를 거래 이제 라신이 양태스는 근데 또 나나 되는 거 송요 예절이냐 대하라 양은 대버 주여서 제가 유 동방이 또 유라 양자 덴버 주머를 제고 해기 안에 가서 동딘 최진기 뭐 보가요 말해서 매바서 동상 지부마다 가요 말해서 매바서 유 동방이다 동방이 또 로호라 니가 라신이 주변 동바래서 라신 주변 가야 매 라신 주변 동바래서 되네자 라신이 당번이나 랑근의 주 많이 와이자 될이야 안에 라신이 양 동방이 될 민가로선 라신이 양대라고 해야지 라신이 양대 대한 양은 대버주셔야 돼.
The verse, or the reply concludes with, because the support does not exist, it is not produced. That too is proclaimed to be nirvana. The meaning here then, firstly of the third line, is that both the object that is investigated and has found to be empty of inherent existence, as well as the investigating consciousness, the wisdom that has now realized emptiness, this too is empty of inherent existence. So both the object and object possessor, or what is investigated, and the analyzing consciousness are empty of inherent existence. And this understanding, that now into the fourth line, this understanding that no phenomenon has ever existed inherently is proclaimed or said to be non-abiding nirvana.
Dalai anjugida to godibura shuwene, deji samno tangandi, zebaro kale sonlamna, Dongbani to belo di yu digi yu dongbani rangxin to be dongguo de ine, korong ge dongbani dogo marwas, ma to ban zang korong rangxin ma zhubo to belo xianda xi dogo de, diang ane, go lo rangxin ma zhubo to lo xianda xi do se ne, tume cha ru de, jiza rangxin ma zhubo to ya ge duzi koran cha ge me no se ji, zebaro xi disingur wa da. Na don de ne di delia an len ro jing zo ji go di bu ro xu wen ne gar song go se ne. 像东巴尼多少的与东巴尼与西几个点了呀？那就东巴尼干啥个点不准备了？这干啥东巴尼多才越钱了？可能东巴尼多一点，是不用钱现在这些干啥点不准备？这把那这把就是不被什么忙不当就都这把这东西多过了哇？你那些什么当过嘛的时候，等等了，什么当过嘛的？ 제가 강사 내 가지고 줘봐 걸리고 그래서네 동방이 또 별로 되기 동방이 도고 할때 코론 동방이 또 별로 코론 동방이 코론 도고 말어 와서 마도 봐서 코론 동방이 대바 마도 또에 들로 산다지기 도고로 와서 니 동방이도 로 산다지기 도고로 디 섬들 투매 차로 그래서네 줘봐 딜레로 와다 다 줘봐 딜레로 와다 디베는다 지상 동이 동방이 또 별로 되게 당보 강사의 동방이 또 발라 渐渐那么日本蒙古三当，云南蒙古三当这多活了哇。实际上，你刚才的那个东北人多才会接了，东北人多不落地，呢，可能东北人多也三东北人多也的，这些年嘛三当完了，日本军人不定的三当过嘛的，可能三当完怎么有东北人多土个是我的，东北人多土个是。 西几点都东北人也不多才会接了，西可能记得什么单位东西什么单位，南上东西多路的，什么的，你嘛拿心改了么不叫我嘛，那时候的。
To present then the meaning of the question and the answer clearly and concisely. So, firstly, the doubt here is that should one come. So, this is the doubter speaking. Should emptiness be realized? What about that realizing consciousness? How can we be certain that it is not inherently existent? We'd need to investigate that. And should we find that it is also empty, what about that realizing consciousness? And then that would need to be investigated too. And this would be endless. And all our time and energy would be spent on investigating a consciousness after another. And this would prevent us from actually developing the antidote of the wisdom correctly realizing emptiness. So that is the doubt. Then the response to that is that in order to realize emptiness, one has to do extensive study and investigation or analysis, thorough analysis. And after engaging in careful analysis, meticulous analysis, detailed analysis, exhaustive analysis, one will know without any doubt that the object is empty. And because of all this analysis that has been done over a sustained period, when one applies this realization of emptiness to a second object, one will not have to go through this entire sequence of analysis again because of how thoroughly, comprehensively, meticulously one has already analyzed in order to attain that initial realization of emptiness. One can take that realization with all the reasoning that led to it and apply it to any object, and without effort, one will recognize that it too is empty of inherent existence.
像东北人刚才个变的西气，刚才个定的东北人多差外，那东北多差面呢，但那个东北人多比个落地。 就可女包肉去越的别个不了，就像 디 덴바 두바레 셈베 덴진디 리기 마레스 덴질레요 마레제 마제 안에 동반이디 당보 동반이 또야디 제바제 망고 김제 망보다 삼나고다 제바제 갈레 망고 여러와 디스들 마저 고로 고고로와 제자디 동반이 강사게 된도 동반이 또 차이외 제라 안 동반이 또 별로 코롱 동반이 라시 마저 또야라 디진예만 하제 삼나 망보다 제바제 디니 제고 그거 말레스 그래서네 안에 디네 제고나 야 고롱도 별로 디야 디 덴바두머레 제바지 김제 망보 삼다 디제 덴데 투메세데 결혼셰바 나신 덴바 차이고레스 이나 디니기 제자 동반이 직도 세외 제라 아니 양자 고롱도 또 동반이 또 별로 고롱 동반이 이미 제바지 균능부 제바 제고 막 가지고 남사 통화점에 삼도 땅화점이 고 덴바두머 삼 땅화점이 남성고 덴바 마트가 또 주고 그래제
To repeat the answer, if, let's say it's the person that is being analyzed, person appears as if it exists by way of its own nature or essence, and then one realizes it is empty of existing in the way that it appears, emptiness is realized, then to get to that point, one has studied and meditated exhaustively, developing a vast amount of knowledge and applying that knowledge through thorough analysis over an exhaustive period of time. And one has now come to realize emptiness. So in dependence on the power of that realization of emptiness that has come about, independence itself, independence on a vast amount of analysis, which itself came about in dependence on a vast accumulation of knowledge, the power of that realization will mean that when another object after the meditation appears as truly existent, immediately one will be able, the meditator will recognize that object is empty of inherent existence. It does not exist in the way that it appears. And if they re-enter meditation, looking at the person or another object, without needing to go through all this meticulous reasoning, they will immediately recognize that that object is empty of inherent existence. And the reason they can immediately realize emptiness is because of the power of that prior realization that had come about in dependence on such an accumulation of knowledge and thereby a detailed analysis.
시 강사가 된도 동반이 강사디 라신 동반이 또바 있나 다디 제려야 안에 소수기 풍보를 삼다면 풍보디 라신 주바레 말에 삼다인데 남사 풍보 라신 말로 또 두그리 했어요. 디나시 안에 현기 풍보를 삼다면 소수기 풍보 라신기 소수 강사디 나랑 소수랑 나 세드 라신 말로 또 세베제라 현기 풍보디야 라신 주바레 삼다는 대시게 삼 대신예마게 삼다 김산 다가랑게 남사 라신 말로 또 두그리 지나델이야 김산 현다 사바다지 야야지 사바다 삼당 거요 말람사 예마게 라신 마주바 삼다의 리바딜을 때는 남사 어 라신 마주버에서 삼도 두그리 해서 근데 배로시는 아주 매로시는 매직리야 라바 투데 차위라자 뇨바이나 되네 메리카네 쉐베네 통화는 어디 차와 열에 선비기 디 차와 열다 매 삼당에는 남사 디 차부 열나면나 삼당은 차부 열에 선비기 삼도디 남사 코르투고로 와매 베네 칭기 메다 자기 메다 지카데시네 디니기 지기 매 마보 열나 디니기 마보를 메데베네 메로시나 남사 대신예마 메르 레도 사팅 지지 렉자를 묘 차와인자 체명해바니 차와인자 다 메간데 주투나 차와 열에 요 말했으면 삼당에 남사 참 차와 열에 선비기 남사디 was
if one initially is investigating the person, the basis of analysis is the person, to see the person we recognize appears as existing by way of its own essence, and we investigate and we realize it's empty of existing by way of its own essence, and emptiness is realized, then if we now take a new object, and say the aggregates, the body or the mental consciousnesses, and investigate if they exist in the way they appear, because this prior realization of emptiness didn't just come about, it didn't happen to arise in our mind, but came about in dependence on meticulous analysis over a sustained period, we will readily, or immediately realize the body or the mind is empty of existing by way of its own essence. And then if we were to take a different object, say the aggregates of someone else's body, someone else's mind, again, without needing to rely on those prior reasons or new reasons, through the power of the previous realization that had come about in dependence on such careful and thorough analysis, immediately we'll recognize that this object, another person's aggregates, are empty of existing by way of their own nature. So that is the meaning of the reply here. And then to give an analogy that we all have experience of, is when we were little, we only had to burn our hand once to know that fire is hot. And if we burnt our hand, let's say on the stove, we will know to stay away from any other hot surface. Or if we burnt ourselves with a lighter, we'll know that whether wood is burning or paper is burning, fire is hot. Fire will burn us. So we only need to realize this once, and we will stay away from fire.
Sangha zugi shi jigi tendo ta penanga za gansa se dangpo gansa tendo tempa jumo de jeba china gansa da rashin ma zho do channe de ne gansa rashin ma ba do cha rashin ma zho ba ji gom ji du jebe ne dan di je le ya chu nyam sha le chu ji de dang ji yu kan de tong wei ne de shi yu kan de tong wei ne ji na ya le ya rang wen de zhu ba nang ge wei ne o da de rang wen de zhu ba sa de 자기는 요말 규만하시리 선비게 쳐서 삼는 날에 되는 샤르고 그러와 규만하시리 쳔 되는게 나서 쳐서 규만하시리 아 선비마도 뭐이니 나와 나신다 가라데 요 말에 선비게 삼는 규만하시지 삼는 걸투고 고고 그래지래 제가 되는 자 그 지기 때는 라시마로 또 세위지래 양 직들이야 라시마로 받대 빼다 디양원에라 인세를 선비 삼로 계시 제바 제와야 되네 거요 말 제가 된 라시마로 직도 세위디 공배지라 유간의 통이나 나도 어디 유만하시리 나와 나신다 뒤네요 요 말에 선비 삼로디 콜로리아 생기기도 연구를 해지래
When an object has been realized to be empty, so if, let's say, the person is realized to be empty of inherent existence, thereafter, in subsequent attainment, due to the power of that meditative experience or that experience in meditation, the meditator will go about their activities. Phenomena or objects will appear to consciousness. There will be objects of thought. And the meditator will innately, spontaneously, without effort, recognize that these phenomena do not exist in the way they appear. They are empty of existing in the way they appear. Rather, they are likened to illusions. So the key point here is that after the realization of emptiness, this understanding arises innately. That whatever phenomenon, that despite phenomena, whatever that phenomenon may be, appearing as if it is existent by way of its own nature, it does not exist in the way that it appears. It is empty, and therefore is like an illusion. And this understanding naturally, innately arises.
당보 직접 빠르지갑 양 직접 빠르지갑 다디도 두신의 직빠르게 파잡지 또 직샤로 와 직샤지만 그 무드에 적음이도와 직 번이 직접지 라바 데니스 되는 빠르지갑 데니스 되는 빠르지갑이고 와 맞아 적음이도 원래 된 데니 빠르잡서질 데니게 빠르 망고시갑네 직샤도 직샤지 양아도 두시든 데모 통도 갑을 빼 무드에 잡되 버려 통고를 와가지고 무드에 시우 적여 받는 거를 와 제가 내내기 데모 수당 하고 간 지요로 와다 하고 간 지게 타도 그 무디 접거를 해서 무디 접거 말에 돼 당보지 잡디네 직제도 수는네 두고를 정해서 나와라 무디제 차와나 있는 거를 이내 된다라 뭐이니술라 무디제 접거 말에서 비게 코삼는 날이야 데모 수당 되네 직직 하고 차나 데모 가르통서 디즈 샤사 직발에서 비게 나와 디리그로 와 먼저 한 먹어나 나서 디게 안 먹어도 무티지 유누시 저기요 바지 지금 무디네 잡되어 봐 통고를 봐 지난 나야 무티든 잡고요 봐 난거데 되는 엄마도 배 잡다들 무티지 잡고 말아 봐 제가 되니기 하고 한 미치기 살아직 되네 하고 미치기 때마 가르치 통나에 어디 무티기 잡고요 봐 난거데 디셔서 무티기 잡고 말에 선비 삼로디 콜셈 딩기고 한게 되는 걸 리그로 봐 디나신 동방이 또한 가사 되기 동방이 또 세외 제일이야 근데 가르치 나나랑 뭐들 난거데 이내 디스 나와나시 요 말에 선비게 셈 한게 리리도 거래 나랑 저 동방이 뭐도 봐자 끝나는 어떻게 가서 비제 쇠사다 한 먹어 가사에 무디는 차고도 와서 배 삼로 리그로 와 진짜 디나시 템버도 추가리 나와나시 주요사에 선비게 삼나를 리거래 네가 생각하지 내가데 하고 말아 제 템버 쇠사나시 한 먹어 와나시 무디는 차고도 선비게 삼로 리그로 디나시 나 저기 템버 쇠사 하고 한 디기 무디네 차고만 받을 세부 간테 토나 차고 말씀 배 하고 두고 그래 나저 하고 두고 말 베디나신 동이 시지기 된도 동방이 또 사회 제라 시간이 되네 지간 나베네 랑원으로 요 말에 나와나시 요 말에 선비 규만 하시 시작도 그래 당 지금 마도 봐인자 마술에 나와나시 요래 선비 한게나 리디거래 디케버티는 시고래.
Again, to bring this to an analogy that we can relate to more easily. So someone probably like all of us, but certainly myself, I know nothing about filmmaking. And if I watch, let's say, a film, a sequence of dance, I may be quite amazed by what I see, thinking, that was a flawless performance. And how did they manage to perform for so long? This is really quite phenomenal. But someone else watching that same performance, who's a filmmaker, understands the editing process, understands that different sequences of film can be joined together in a way that appears seamless to the untrained eye, they will watch that and have a very different experience. They will marvel at the skill of the dancers, but also of the editors. So those who understand filmmaking, who have experience in filmmaking, will watch the same sequence of dance as someone like myself who does not, and have a very different experience of it. They'll recognize that what is appearing is not how it exists. In a sense, it's manufactured. So just like someone who has realized emptiness, their experience thereafter is completely altered. They will readily recognize that the way phenomena appear is like an illusion. It is false, it is deceptive. It is not how they exist in reality. And they will recognize this innately. They won't need to go through the sequence of reasoning like they had done previously for such an extensive period. Because they have done so meticulously over such a sustained period, it has led to an incredibly powerful realization. And that realization then will impact everything that they thereafter perceive.
디나시 내가 저기 데모 잡도 가라 데모에 잡현다 시에다 시우다 당원에 하고 관계 그거도 시에 당한 미션다시 당고 봐 잡견되게 시에 원에 당고 막 거기 이게 당고 봐도 가도 통고를 봐 근데 이거는 하고 관계 이제 그 그런 잡견 그런 것이 당고 말해서 배sam도 세우하고 두고 봐 당한주 규명의 지간 지변에 어차간 되게 배지 잡을 지하고 해야고 휴당도 선비에 삼당 곧 나도 보도 때만은 다용도 갑라 아주 가르치는 거로서는 시에 그런 당고 받는 것도 와 이내 된당 오마라 코라던 게 현다시 당도 거로 와 지도 권이 득샤로 와 다 규여간지기 통원도 갈라 시에도 그런 요 말했으면 샘 딩기 곧 생기 곧 삼당고 말 한기 남서 하고 두고 와 당아주 넘준 규명의 지나 디하고 두고 어거 시에하고 싶던 것은 비게 삼는 데 두고 와 제가 되는 인자 디 고뇌에서 하고 간디기 아니 하고 사회인자 그 아니 남사 디 나완 그런 당고 받는 능고 봐 이내야 샘 한gel이야 어거 당고 말해서 배섬려 봐 디나신 동반이 또 사긴 가서 되라 유간이 나나 랑원을 받는 거데 어랑은 디나신 요 말해서 배섬을 한gel이 두고 와래 당아주 하 먹어한디게 시 하 먹어한디게 아니 근데 때에 그 시에하고 싶 당도 선비게 삼는지 차위에하고 차위 시에하고 당도 선비게 삼는 리투로 와 리 삼콜고로 와 지난 디나신 마도 동반이 마도 반자 유거리나나 랑문도 나와네 나와나신 안다가라 인서에서 비기 리고로 돼 베로 지수딩아 저게 베디게다 둠디고 하고 도야 자고로 봐.
Again, someone like myself who really doesn't know anything about film production or the techniques involved with singing and dancing, I can watch something and be really quite impressed by the skill of the performers and think what wonderful talent they have. But those who are knowledgeable, both of film production as well as of the techniques required to sing and to dance, they'll be able to watch it quite differently, the same performance, because they are watching with through consciousness that is enthused or mixed with knowledge and skill that I lack. So they will see the same performance and think, oh, they're not bad. But I can see they're using technology here. Perhaps they're using auto-tune, or they're using good editing. They're not showing, they've edited out the bits where they got it a little bit wrong. And they will have quite a different experience of the same video than someone like myself who lacks knowledge and skill in this area. So too then, when it comes to the realization of emptiness. Us, ordinary people who have not realized emptiness, we believe phenomena exist in the way they appear. The way they appear is how they are. But someone who has actually realized emptiness, for them, despite phenomena thereafter still appearing as truly existent, they will innately know that that's false. That this appearance is like an illusion. Phenomena do not exist in the way they appear. And that will innately arise within them because of their experience gained in meditation based on knowledge and extensive analysis that came about due to that knowledge.
Denigi nani mitun ba ha ko khan digi nani mitu kare thona nani mitun ba de samle dina jing a ju chue gan de na ne nang su le nang su de da ni ngui ni su ni mitun ba nani mitun ba sha go ji da nang su de kala rang ngui ni ju ba ko rang ngui ni ju de ba nang go de ne ngui ni su la gang rang ngui ni ju ba se de zao ni me ba de se nani mitun ba de ji da de ni za dong ba ni do ba na nani mitun ba de se ba ha hu tu go de Just
like, so then, just summarizes, just like a filmmaker will not watch film in the same way as a non-filmmaker will, in that they will recognize all that is gone into this production, and therefore what is appearing is not how it exists. So too, in accordance with reality, those who have seen reality, who have realized emptiness, they will know innately whatever appears to them is fake, is likened to an illusion. Phenomena do not exist in the way they appear, and this they will know innately.
Pune sam oni gi xiyu de nge xin gomba na ne rashin so mi ji yu de da oni gi me xin du de na yu zumba yumam milam da bo cha yong di la je sam an pando kan yu se na sa xin.
Continuing in the text. So now we at the last paragraph at the bottom of page 21. So here there's a change to the translation, but I think Andy handed it out a couple of weeks ago. Thus, observing a base ultimately, such as self and other, one ascertains the meaning of being in its very essence at peace. If we become familiar with this, the objects observed, such as self and other, appear as illusion-like or dream-like falsities which, although not existing by way of their own essence, appear to be so.
Dedar shi rangda shen so la mi ne Pooks near sums, Moonigi Shiwas, Moonigi Shiwas. Just not the Benarazugi, the Teters Jebaches, or the Nanzo Jeba Teters, the Jebaches, or then Nanzula now, Nashinji can down, but none can Nangu Sepe, Nansu the Samta. Then now, Nashinji do a Mindus Jebache and this or. Then she Rang Dashan, that Jebache, she did Rang. Rang le shen le sha, bene rang le sam da je rang nga se di kasang zu kisi man xue de nga zu nga se de rang le nang su de kan nang du stang bo nang su kan nang du sam da de nga se de nga zu pung bo da sam lo kan lai ma de ko rong wen ni ju tu be nang go le je de di na wa na xin chi pa du ge min du je ba che de an pu ne za wa ne se ro da ji de Pune Mabadang and one issue around when you do the Dompasi do Grazero, one issue Pune, some more Puk said, one year rang when she was the Dogres, she will do nation said. Just a dish rang Celeshan, rang Shan Shigorwa.
Let's look at the first sentence, or start with the first sentence, or the first part of the first sentence. Thus, observing a base ultimately, such as self and other, one ascertains the meaning of being in its very essence at peace. So, taking as an illustration the self, so the self then, if we take that as an illustration, will be the base that is to be investigated ultimately. Or instead of ultimately, one can say deeply or in depth. So here, to investigate a basis, such as the self, in depth, in detail, the first step is to see how it appears to consciousness. How does our sense of I, our sense of self, appear to us? And in brief, it appears as if it is independent of, for example, our physical aggregate, our body, as well as our mental aggregates, our consciousnesses. So it appears as if it's disconnected, separate from our body and mind. This is how the basis, in this case, the self, appears.
Nawa samta, di nawa na shi yume jeba che dirwa rang samta. Da shen la samta de shen se di kanis nang de sebe rang ngarang gi phungbo da sheba da su phungbo lo su shen ji nang go ba je. Di nawa na shi du yume de jeba che ba yo ma ko ye de ro ba da. Ra shen se shi ro shen da la samta ba ne shen di nang du kanis nang de se ne ngi phungbo da sheba le lo su shi nang du Dinawa Nashi Yoro Yoma Chebachina, Dinawa Nashi Yorwade. Dini Chebachamar, Shense, Shenle Chebachitadi. Deji Rang la Chebachitadi, Rang said, Nga said, Kanisnangu to love this Chebachiduka, some Tadukabla, Nga said, Narang a Pumbo, Narang a Sheba, Loso, Chinangudus. The Dinawa Nashi Duge Minus Chebachigorwa. Then Shenle Mishanda, Rang Lamaji, Mishanda Chilimiche, Shenle Chebachidu can see Shen di nga ngi pungpo dan sheba le lo su ngo rangshin tadeba nangudu di nawa ne duwe mindu sheba cheba chego rebesne di cheba chea ma reche shen di rang le lo su yoro ba de ko nawa na shin ngarang ge pungpo dan ngarang sheba le jawa meba phini yue de ba na shin dagara yue de ro ba di yue ba na shin jub de de jena di cheba chea ma reche.
So looking here, such as self and others. So the self, as I mentioned in the previous segment, this appears to us as if it is independent of our aggregates, our physical and mental aggregates, disconnected, unrelated, separate from them. Then what about other? So other persons, or persons other than oneself? Well, they are separate from our aggregates, from our physical and mental aggregates. So here, one would not investigate whether a person other than myself is separate from my body and my mind, because in reality they are separate from our body and mind. So that style of analysis then would not be utilized when investigating a person other than oneself. But when it comes to oneself, one's own person, then this is one looks, how does it appear to our consciousness? And there we recognize it appears as if it's independent of our physical and mental aggregates.
And Shen La Mi ne, Shen La Mi che, and Shen de Rang when you do Maru said the Jebajak and Chikore La de, Shen Pa Shen Li Mi che, Shen de Sosolea, Lola can Nangdu si be Nanta di Nanta some night. Nanta de can some down or Shen said the Korongi Pine, Korongi Pumbo down, Korongi Sheba le Losuchi, Nangdu, Nangorda, Dinata de Shen said, Michelle Devane Shen said, Korongi Pumbo Mayimba, Korongi Sheba Mayimba, Korongi Pumbo Teda, Korongi Sheba le Jawa Maybe, Korong when you drew to West Nangore. Odinawa Nashinjita, to give me the Jeva Jedire, Jesa Korongi, Korong Shen said, Korongi Pumbo le Loso Canistu, Korongi Sheba la Matuba Canistu, those Jeva Chidi, Korong Pumbo and Sheba la Matuba, Rang when you drew the Shen said, yeah, Mabade. Never the Dus Jeva Jeriche, Chisamado, Pushen said, Narangi Pumboda, Sheba le Losu, Nawana, do me the Jeva Jamare. Chisa Shen said, Shan said, Gansa Shendi, and then out Jeva Chi Gansa Shen Yorwa, the Shidi, Nanzo Nanang Gansanangosene, Gansa said, Korongi Pumbo did, Sheba le Madio Koron, Loso, Rang when you drew Bachin Nankore. Dinawa Nashinda, Shendi, Koroshengi Pumbo la Matuba. Gane do me the Shimshid, Koro Pumboda, Nanga Sheba la Matubi, Shen Yakini Meva, don't such Tungore. They told me Shen Rashi Mato Topa Esore.
The way then to investigate people other than ourselves is not to investigate whether they are separate from our body and mind, which is as they appear, because that is in accordance with reality. They are separate from our body and our mind, our physical and mental aggregates. But the way to investigate people other than ourselves, so what in our text, such as self and other, the other than people other than ourselves, is they too appear to our consciousness as if that person is unrelated or separate or different from their body and mind, their physical and mental aggregates. So when investigating ourself, the way we appear to our consciousness is that we appear, or ourself appears to be unrelated to or separate or independent of our body and mind. And when we investigate people other than ourselves, they too appear to our consciousness as if that person is independent or separate or different from their body and their mind. And this then we investigate to see if this is the case or not, if they exist in the way that they appear or not, and we come to realize that they are empty of existing in the way they appear to our consciousness.
Marangi rangi pumbo na sheba la madyoba rangu ngwene druptuba chi mebare. Meba zanda, ta nga sayade kanda shurasene nga sayade nga rangi pumbo na sheba la pa tuyene pa lue shaba zami, lue taba zami yobare se. Obe dina shin, shen sayade yam, shen korong gasa shen di, korong pumbo na korong sheba la madyoba, korong ngwene rangu ngwene druptuba shen chi mebare. Dana kanda shurasene, shen sayade, shen korong pumbo na an sheba la pa tuyene lue shaba zami yobare se. Odu sumul.
This process of investigating self and other is very similar. The difference is at the beginning of the analysis. With the self, how does myself appear to consciousness, to my consciousness? And that is, it appears as if it's independent of my physical and mental aggregates, my body and mind. With relation to other, how do they appear to our consciousness? They also appear as being independent of their own body and their own mind, their own physical and mental aggregates. So the difference here is in terms of other, in their whether they exist independently of their body and mind, and with ourself, does our self exist independently of our body and mind? Then with both, one investigates and comes to recognize that the self or the other does not exist in the way that it appears, is empty of existing in the way that it appears. And emptiness is realized, emptiness of self, emptiness of other. And then, but how does the self exist? How does the other person exist? Merely imputed by mind onto the basis of the aggregates. Therefore is a dependent arising, dependent on labeling by mind. Mind labels the person onto the physical and or mental aggregates, just like with the other person. The other person too exists as a dependent arising, dependent on labeling onto the physical and mental aggregates.
Sok sede rangda shen sok la de sok na la mangbo ngor bene nga jige yuma de beketa bene jige xingda zi xingda an jige jungwa shi la so ba da chue kan de ne xing no ro chi ne xing se di korong gi jeba che de ka la xing se nang du ngan zo xing se lo pa nang no du korong zawa na ya ga dang an jige de ne ka ma de ba kor xing rang wen du ba na wa na xin da xing di de ne du me de jeba che du xing di Denigi kora zawada yagada deni dongpola soba matyo ba xing loso chi xaaya mea de. Chisa denigi kang matyo denigi chashila matyo ba rangungwe ni dhuba meba tongsan chi tongyo du xing rang xing ba dhuba tongwa re se chi. Da xii gari tendu xeba che na du si na samdana jiba cha go re.
The third term, others. So we have here, thus observing a base ultimately, such as self and other. So other then refers to everything else that exists other than oneself or persons other than oneself, all other phenomena. So if we take something straightforward, a tree, that appears to consciousness as being independent, self-existent. But when we investigate, we see it cannot be so. It is clearly dependent. For example, it's dependent on the weather. So depending on what the season is, the tree will behave or show itself in a particular way. So very quickly one can recognize that if one has clearly recognized that the tree appears to us as being independent, one can then recognize quickly that it is actually dependent. And thereby, it's empty of existing in the way that it appears.
Gomba na di done ya gomyo de ane di gomyo de ane gombe ge den jele ga yung gos ne ra shen so mi ji yu de da wo ni me xin du de nang wi de sang ga zo nang yu de ga da ra da shen yu ra shen so mi ji yu de da wo ni me xin du nang wi zun ba am gyu ma ji sa di du shi ne ga nang yu de ra da shen yu kanis nangna rang wen ju ba nang go re de ji da de ni ge de ji je ba ji dong ba ni do ce we chi la nang xin du me ba re na wa na xi yo ma re s ne jun ba am yu ma na xi re se de ani milam da bo cha se ji da yu ma milam da bo cha se milam na xin cha yung go re s da dong ba ni do cha wa je la nang yo de ga sa za gang la ma rang wen ju ba nang go de ne ya 로리아 가르삼 리고스 온나와나 신 자기네 요마라 셈비기 대 준바레 준지 준바레 나나 나나데 준바레스 유마나지레 밀람나지레 셈비기 야 로리아 데니시 리고레 차르투고레 해지레
Completing the first sentence then, thus observing a base ultimately. So the base is what's being investigated, ultimately means looking at its deep nature, such as self and other. One ascertains, such as self and other. So the such as referred then to any phenomena other than self and other. One ascertains the meaning of being in its very essence at peace. So this is a more unusual way of being in its very essence at peace. Is a more uncommon way of saying being in its very essence, being empty of natural existence. Be the more normal way of writing. But His Holiness used less common term, which literally is being in its very essence at peace, which means empty of inherent existence, empty of existing by way of its own nature. Then the second sentence, if we become familiar with this, the objects observed, such as self and other, appear as illusion-like or dream-like falsities. So here, dream-like falsities, which, although not existing by the way of their own essence, appear to be so. Here then the meditator has gone through the process of recognizing firstly how phenomena appear, investigating to see if they do exist in the way they appear. So the way they appear is as if they exist by way of their own essence. There's something defining about the object that enables it to exist from its own, by way of its own essence, to be self-existent. But when investigated, one realizes that they are empty of existing by way of their own essence. They're empty of existing from their own side. And this is when one realizes that they are empty of existing by way of their own essence, or in their very essence, they are at peace. So that's in meditation. In post-meditation, as was mentioned in the previous segment, as all phenomena appear to the yogin's consciousness, despite they're still appearing to be true or truly existent, they are recognized to be false or falsities. Despite appearing as being true, in other words, the way that they're existing by way of their own nature, the yogin knows through the power of their realization that they are false, not true, and therefore are likened to an illusion or a dream.
Then 지게 지신라서 받으면 가래 이나 차상 현실을 뛰는 줍되바 마도 현실을 마도바 주바세 자기는 요 말에서 현실을 뛰는 주고래 전에 뛰는 용고래 해야지.
Through the meaning that is being presented here is that all phenomena are empty of existing by way of their own nature. All phenomena are in their very essence at peace. Yet they still appear as being truly existent, but that is not how they exist, and therefore they can be likened to illusions or dreams. Nothing exists by way of its own nature or essence. Nothing at all is inherently existent. Not oneself, one's own person, not any other person, or any other phenomenon, such as a tree. Everything is empty of existing by way of its own nature. But phenomena do still exist. How do they exist? Dependently. How do they not exist? Independent. How do they exist? Dependent. Dependent on labeling by mind.
나주기 디기세에 지사 현실을 뛰는 용어마도 셴바도바 용거 말했어. 지사 강라에 마도바 랑응원의 주시 디기디메 말해. 지사 디기세에 대화단 기부세에 현실을 뛰는 용거 거래서. 지사는 다 디기세에 다 탈바세에 나이나라 상유고마세는 현실을 뛰는 용어 개와 침마세는 현실을 뛰는 용거 거래서. 지사 현실을 뛰는 용거 봐서는 당아주기 디기 주위에 가서 셈 나로야 랑게 셈곰 딘 제바체 딘이서 하고 와체 딘이긴 디기 지 곰바디 셈 야도데 하고 와체 야보디 바 곰바이나 디 곰발레 띠네 아니 야게 줘는 디기 두고 그래서 디순 거래.
When coming to understand this topic, it's imperative to apply it to all phenomena, to, let's say, a wide variety of phenomena, to see that nothing exists inherently, everything that exists is a dependent arising. And it's important to apply it to a variety of phenomena so we come to recognize, for example, that the happiness we long for, this too exists, it's a phenomenon, and therefore, if we investigate, we'll see it doesn't exist by way of its own nature, but it's empty of existing by way of its own nature, but it exists as a dependent arising. And why this is so important to recognize is that the attainment of happiness, because it exists but only as a dependent arising, not by way of its own nature, through developing causes, happiness will grow within us. Through developing our familiarity, in other words, strengthening those causes, our happiness will grow. This means the attainment of lasting, stable happiness is completely attainable for any of us, because it's a dependent arising. By developing the required causes, the result will follow. And not just happiness, but everything that exists is empty of existing by way of its own nature, but exists as a dependent arising. So too, liberation, or nirvana, which is freedom from the sufferings of samsara, that too is a dependent arising. So too is enlightenment.
Ani chigi dwe shala soba nyomo ba tisili tinde yungo reche. Chisanda nyomo ba tisu meba suya liya negab tsam meba suya. Nahan chigi nyomo ba dubigi nyomo ba tiki chisa ngonju wa rang sabon meba suya ma tanda ngonju wa tsete liya ngonju wa yune kiya me ting nyomo. Ngonju wa sana nyomo ngondu yune kongro kiya ta kongro ta chisa kiya meba dwe shala kongro düğün anjege ngazule 가용을 düğünle 착be게 착바다 ndi kinchine ne konr게야다 무슨 거 제자디 내가 맞게게 탑시 탑람제다 검나 직제 다디 체델야 된곧 균이 맞게게 다 자워 균이 사본 매바 맞어나 되니 균이 뭐바디 düğünle 차베 녀모바디 균이 매바서야게 탑람 직제 되니 녀모바 사본나 제바 기디네게 사본나 제바 매바서야게 탑람제 Dine saban bachadan jeba meba soya tablam je tablam ma sona da ko meba soya da rimbal ma sona chik dinigi rimba mango je song sha ga ruwa da.
All the problems and difficulties in our life and in the lives of others, these exist. Being existence, we recognize through our prior meditation. They do not exist by way of their own nature, but they are dependent arisings, which means something can be done about them. Because they are empty of inherent existence, but are dependent arisings, antidotes can be developed to eradicate them. And here, to understand antidotes, there are many levels of antidote. There are those which are temporary, such as developing contrary minds, so minds which are opposite to a particular affliction, and thereby will make that arisal of the affliction much less likely, or if it does arise, much weaker. And then there is the ultimate antidote, which is the wisdom realizing emptiness, which eradicates the seeds of the affliction so that they can no longer arise again. And in fact, the wisdom realizing emptiness can be developed when it's conjoined with bodhicitta to also eradicate the imprints or the stains of the afflictions. And thereby there's no trace of the appearance of true existence anymore. So here we understand, firstly, that all our pain, our suffering, problems in our life, these exist, and therefore they are empty, and they are dependent arisings, which means we can eradicate them. And there are antidotes and solutions, which are solutions which we can develop, and these, they are a gradient of temporary as well as the ultimate antidote.
당한 저기 착발을 마서는 유딜라 착비 착발 내가 좀 매봐 줘야기 삼단하르시다. 근데 콩로에네 유딜라 콩로제요 콩로디 내가 브링 매봐 써였습니다. 제가 당한 저기 그 랑은 그 말을 봐인자 매봐 줘야 된 현실을 뛰내고 콩로 매봐 줘야 돼 유딜라 착발 매봐서 랑은 왜네 매봐 줘야 매봐래. 제가 현실을 뛰내 그 매봐 줘야 내가 매봐 줘야 뒤속으로 봐. 근데 나중에 가서 유딜라 착발 없이 해배네. 배는 저기 창세의 동야를 창들이야 착과 제베나 배들이야 창디 동야에 될 배치 착과 여베나 델이야 다디 착과 매바데 내가 매바가는 쇠고리 람나 다 창들이 괜다래 괜 어다 창들이 다 창도 동베나 안지 창도 뇌할이야 공치모리샤 안디 동베이나 안에 라신제 소수기 레가티기 파 지게 제제 내가 제마도 봐 찍제 안 라신데 파 찍 조디가로 파 리진 수불나 나사다야 안 지게 라신데 찍 기시 바타마르시 밀르네비 찍라제 데니게 강아테야 아니 디메세 소소기 데니게 마중 바이네 소소로 수불라 동야 망타는데 수불 파 찍 제네 찍게 나사다지 안디기 이견샤 데니게 베 독자로 와서 비견냐야 창들이야 연된 균에마다 균냐 통화는 지산 균다원 딜에 되기고 말해. 지산 되어가지고 창라 잡에 차과돼 내가 가두고 말해. 그 창라 잡에 차과돼. 지산 되니기 지산 유딜이야. 파 균게 지산 저기 미두보 공부하세 되셔 휴침벌 미두보 공부 그래서 미두보하세 배균 균야 삼다지 그러고 지산 되니기 삼다 잡은 내가 창라 잡에 차과기고 가고 그래. 이내야 그 양 기행산다지 최선의 기회가 니가 여러봐. 그래서 내가 가야라 두스진의 잡아가야기 유대나 될이야. 잡아기기나 유대를 지다 유대를原定 차다 균이 제니가 연구래. 균이 차디만 뭐 삼다외네 될 잡아기고 말해. 다디기原定 차디만 뭐 삼다네 되네 될이야 되바 숙치면 기용을. 그래서 장한테 배기워 semmel을 차도 그래. 아니 지기 마디니 여러서 아니 제 탕체반에 배다그래서 비디原定 차바기 용을. 그래서 될 균경야 다체반에 삼삼는 다반에 될 차바 방법 내가 방야 삼다나 디지 차고래.
We take first of all attachment or desire. Here, if one has recognized that attachment, perhaps for a specific object, is playing is causing problems in one's life, there is some wish to give up the attachment for that thing, but it's difficult. So and the reason is attachment comes because of the mind believing in the good qualities of the object, and that from attaining those good qualities within the object, happiness will be achieved. So here, as a temporary antidote, we shift our attention from the benefits of what we know we really should do without, and focus our attention on the faults. Because whatever we see as undesirable, we don't desire. The reason we desire something is because we are focused on the more positive aspects of that object. So if someone recognizes that their life would be better with no alcohol in it, then a temporary antidote would be to turn one's attention away from the pleasures that they associate with alcohol, and therefore the desire arises, and rather to focus on the faults. Again and again reminding themselves that, for example, drinking is expensive, that's money I could rather use for other things. If I drink too much, then I often end up in conflict. The next day I don't feel so well. This now that I'm a bit older, it impacts the work, the quality of the work I can do. And also I know that it's having an impact on my health. So all this is widely known, but attachment still arises. Why? Because the mind still associates, in this case, alcohol, with all the other benefits. So we need to focus again and again and again on the harmful aspects of alcohol, and then dissatisfaction towards alcohol will arise, and no desire will. But if we continue to see alcohol as desire and as source of happiness, attachment, desire will continue to arise. but to changing our focus, our attention, we will see it as harmful, and therefore be a mind of dissatisfaction towards it will dominate, and thereby we will no longer have attachment for that particular object. So the illustration is alcohol, because that's easy to understand, but of course one can and should apply it to wherever one needs to overcome attachment. In terms of a temporary antidote to anger, if you notice that you have conflict with a particular person, this is something no one enjoys and we'd like to be free of. So here we need to focus on our way of thinking, because merely thinking of this person, let alone seeing them or having to engage with them, our mind becomes disturbed, agitated. So here we need to transform how we think of them, because right now we see within them a source that makes our anger justified. We need to change how we see this person. Meditate with love towards them. Develop a tender attitude towards them. Focus on their good qualities. And in this way, if we do so repeatedly, then when we think of this person, a softer attitude will arise. But whilst we're training, call them to mind, remind yourself that of their good qualities, and do this again and again, and then when one meets them, one's attitude will be transformed. So this too is a temporary solution, because anger will still arise, perhaps towards someone else or another event, but it is a solution that is important to develop.
Desole chakbe chabada, duyen la kebi nyomo bada, karimine, duyen la nyomo batiki, chasan, and mipi, duyen la mipi nyomo batiki, monjua chasan zao yin meva sebala, karagosini, shine tubure, shine gomores, shine tub, sosakilo, shine kia tsawe chela, then ya something you wish him to say, wishing him to ski gore. Chazada, the niggy wishing him to kia tsawe chela, then duyen pa. De be gyuen de pa sam da ya dene delan duen dela mi je an duen dela duen da kam go ma de be ya ho re se be sam da ba na an dene gi shirana ba che lam se de shine drup chai we je la ane chini ke sa ne ngo shin yum ju se de kam go me sem chi ga ju le gi go re di ge chai we je la ngo shin yum ju drup chai we je la ane di kar sam da ya ding ji gong go ding ji ne kar gong go se ne Duyen la, and deba la, mipi deba la, rakpa samta. Dela de something kam gomati be, yakure samta dusin, shiraga namba chan gomine, di gombale tene, dujene, noazuki debin, kansam chilia, debin yomo, onjua, zao yin mebaji, sutu pantu gore, chesa, de pantu gore. That's onjua pamada, sabon bayo mare, inada. Dini gyungushin nyomju de manyam ko kene manyam babala tan nyomoke yo yuneyama debe nyomoke ya mares debe dyen la chapegi dyen la mikbe nyomo batike ke yo mares chisa di deso ane ne ngonju ame ba pambala shine tu ko gore shine top ko gore shine top ne shine ane samda ko gore je.
I'd certainly encourage you to engage in the cultivation of these two antidotes. And whilst they are temporary, they can bring, or they will bring a relief of suffering. But not only will they reduce our attachment to a particular object or our anger towards a particular person, but they will give us confidence in our meditation, confidence in our ability to transform our mind. And recognizing that we can transform our mind, but there are limitless objects in the desire realm that we can have desire for or aversion against, with this confidence in our ability to transform our mind, not a mere theoretical confidence, but a confidence that has come about due to experience, we can then develop an antidote that will suppress desire for every object in the desire realm, as well as thereby aversion too. And this is done through initially developing calm abiding. And then, once one has achieved actual calm abiding, develop one's meditative stabilization further through using this powerful calm abiding, recognizing the faults of the pleasures of the senses, the various objects that we desire in the desire realm, and therefore we have attachment to, or that lead to aversion or anger arising as well, and seeing the faults of all this, of the desire realm itself, and then give rise to the wish to develop, to experience the pleasures of the form realm, which means developing our concentration further, developing this, because this concentration now is a mind of the form realm. So we develop our concentration further will mean, whilst we are in the desire realm physically, our mind, this particular mind of concentration, becomes a mind of the form realm, and that is the happiness that we strive for. And we do so as to suppress our desire for the pleasures of the pleasures of the desire realm. And when we achieve this concentration of the form realm, it serves to suppress all our desires for objects in the form realm, and therefore our afflictions of the form realm do not arise. Our attachment is suppressed, our anger is suppressed, and so forth. We haven't harmed the seeds. This is not about attaining liberation, but it is a very powerful antidote, albeit temporary, to the arisal of our afflictions.
다 시라 남바징 람세도 공부고래 시라 남바징 람 시와다 라베 남바징 람세오라 시라 남바징 람 시라 남바징 람세오라 시와다 라베 남바징세 대지 시와다 라바세디 시와스는 약보 라바스는 꽤 대세대제사 당봉아 저 신의 줍 세외 제라 안에 가지고서 가르 공고서네 신의 톱 세외 제라 되네 되발 파 라바스다고 그래 되발 라바스는 되발 라바다는 가르에서는 되발 옆에 내 나서 마보 묘라 마보 강아 마보 칼라다 튕게 손에 강 되네기 안에 미디게 가서래 체 통통 되네기 삼다베 빼지 강아지게 파 꿰디게 파 삼다 라바세디 꿰 삼다 다 대라 뒤에체 대라 뒤는 삼단 감 고마되게 배 시월이야 연된이야 가서 체령와 되네게 내 나자다 콩라다 되네게 돈에 강한 매되게 아니 되네게 마출라서 와 되네 매데 배 야부를 선비게 두신에 대발이 배 꿰ኛ야 대라 뒤에 삼단 당보디 삼단 고마되게 배 야부를 선비 삼다 두신의 공비기 디딩이진이 돈에 공고를 신에게 도시의 공고 3대 원신이 더 보고만 대신에 3대 원신이 톱내서 지랍송하되 디 노르겨래 디 말에 3대 원신이 더 보고만 도시의 신에도 검전에 땅 아주 대비 되인라 제비 녀모 원주와디 자와기니 기에 매봐 수고 7번 요마디나 자와기니 기에 원주 균이 기에 매봐 수투고래 되네게 수투고도 빵바 원주와 빵바라 그래 제가 디 원주바 빵요도 되네 삼대 용어신 좀 세지 신의 투고래 신의 투고래 시라 남바진에 람 되네게 되네 아주 되인라 체비 녀모 원주와데 파 매바 소용도 되네 삼대 용어신 좀 세 투고래 아등에 대신에 디 공부하는 일 용어신 투고래 세지 대시 직 랍소 디 노르여다
the method here is one having gained some skill in one's meditation, developing antidotes to attachment and anger, temporary antidote to attachment and anger, wants to develop a far more powerful antidote, which comes with the attainment of actual calm abiding. One then applies oneself to developing calm abiding. When one develops what we would generally call calm abiding, but is an approach to, I think it's called an approach to calm abiding. Access to calm abiding. Then we would call this calm abiding. One can hold the object single-pointedly. But at this point then, when one has the access to calm abiding, then one focuses on the faults of the desire realm and the benefits of the form realm. So the faults of the desire realm would be the conflict that we experience, the illnesses we experience, the short lifespan. These are absent in the form realm. There's not conflict or illness or short lifespans. So one here, having attained what we generally refer to as calm abiding, but it is really an approach, an access to actual calm abiding of the first concentration of the form realm. One now is focusing on the faults of the desire realm, the benefits or the qualities of the form realm, and develops one's meditative stabilization, or normally we'd say concentration, ever further until one attains the actual calm abiding of the form realm, or the first concentration of the form realm. So at this level, one has suppressed, when one has now attained the actual calm abiding of the first concentration of the form realm, one has suppressed all the afflictions of the desire realm. One hasn't eliminated the seeds, but one has suppressed them so that they will not arise and trouble one.
검체 녀모바 방고를 세대다 사번에 제바 방다시고를 동반이 지상 녀모바 사번에 제바 방발라 동반이 또 별로 검체 방고마도 되니 마콤바나 방토에 매버 지상 된다랑아 주 녀모메 매버 쇠딜 신질의 뛰네 매버서 고 녀모바 매버 쇠다 신질의 뛰네 매버서 그래서도 내가 매버 쇠야 안지 삼는 냠는 제 검접 매버서 되니 원주와 차상 매버서야 돼야 신의 죽디 되는 검접치 매버서야. 다디는 사본나 제바 녀모바 사본나 제바 매버서야다 동방이 또 비시라 동방이 또 불러도 검발을 때네 녀모바 사본나 제바 방고 그래야지. 다야 동방이 또 검는 녀모 사본나 제바 두고서 녀모바 바샤 방투고 말했어. 디삼지. 디가 nemba 가르쳐서 장주 셈 공부를 장주 셈 공지 장주 셈이 심비 돈에 동반이 공부 장주 셈나 동반이 니가 다 냠냠는 제발을 때네 안에 가서 녀모 바샤다 제가 도그리에서 제가 두시네다 방이 림바들 봐 대서 라바라바라바라 차차서 두스 방나 송거 당한주 대 동반이 세대 녀모 바 사본은 제가 방야기다 님보 디고마 그신이 나서 디고 시대로 와다.
The antidotes presented thus far should be clear. They all are dependent arisings. They come about independent on causes and therefore are empty of inherent existence, which means all of us can develop them ourselves. Whether the temporary antidote of developing a loving attitude to someone one has conflict with, or focusing on the faults and thereby developing repulsion for a former object of attachment, or developing calm abiding and the actual calm abiding of the first concentration, and thereby suppressing all the afflictions of the desire realm. There's a sequence of causes that need to be accumulated to bring about such a result, which means it's a dependent arising, empty of inherent existence, and achievable for us. And with independence on our own confidence in our meditative ability due to our own experience, when we give rise to a genuine wish, not merely to suppress our afflictions, but eradicate them completely, then we use the calm abiding that has been developed to accumulate further causes primarily the wisdom realizing emptiness, so as to eradicate the seeds of the afflictions. Because the antidotes are presented thus far only suppress the afflictions. Some really only temporarily, others may perhaps were all the desire realm afflictions, but still only a temporary suppression. But to eradicate them so that they can never ever arise again, the seeds need to be eradicated. And only the wisdom realizing emptiness can eradicate those seeds. So in dependence on the union of calm abiding meditative insight, one develops the wisdom realizing emptiness. Then, with those causes in place, and with the other causes such as repeated joyous effort, emptiness will be directly realized, and the seeds of the afflictions will be eradicated. So this then is a far subtler level of antidote. But that wisdom realizing emptiness, if it is conjoined with with another cause, the mind or bodhicitta, then the union of the wisdom realizing emptiness and bodhicitta will enable one, now with the subtlest of antidotes, to progress further and not only to eradicate the afflictions together with their seeds, but also their stains, their imprints. These too then can be eliminated. So here we see a progression progression in subtlety of antidotes, all of which are dependent arisings, come about in dependence on our accumulation of the appropriate causes, and in this way their result will be achieved. So thank you. Then we'll conclude here for this morning. If you have some questions, for example Andy and Cameron, then please do and Anisha, then please feel free to ask. If anyone needs to go, there's no need to stay. Thank you. Andy?
Two types of negatives. You gave the example of, for affirming negative, you gave the plain without trees, which I presume mean PLIN, not PLA. That took me a while. And then for the non-affirming negative, the person that lacks inherent existence. But I can't see a difference, because the person that lacks an inherent existence, you are left with the dependently arisen person. In the same way as with the plane lacking trees, you're left with a plane. I mean, I can see that emptiness by itself is a non-affirming negative, but if you put it into terms of an object lacking inherent existence, why is that a non-affirming negative?
So just to come back at that last sentence, because that's perhaps where the answer lies. When you put it in terms of the object lacking inherent existence, that there is a non-affirming negation. That the person exists as a dependent arising is then the next step. But the lack of true existence is the non-affirming negation.
Yeah, but in the same way, the lack of trees would be a non-affirming negative.
Okay, so to say a plane without trees is an affirming negation. Why, if that is so, then why is a person lacking inherent existence a non-affirming negation?
Because you're left with dependent arising.
You left with dependent arising. Okay.
Then dango morangi jua koko masona ni santuari. Then keran mayinga ki petsende shindo mebe tam mebe shindo.
Shindo mebe tam.
Shindo mebe tam. Ne petsende song. Then mega ki petsen kansa oni
Madhva.
Ne ako tomso. Ne samde te ni kia parimare. Karensa shindo mebe tam sena. Then aso tam yare. Then kansa tempa matrupa. Then aso kansa yare. Kareza then
China di dirwa kansa di yorwa 다데 신동 그 신동 매비 탕라빈도 고야라 카로스 신동 요 말에서 고고와 디슈라 카로 탕디 요래 생고스 고고도와 제자디 신동 매비 탕라네 많이 가래서 디래 가사 코라 라시 요 말에서 라요도 가사 코 라시 요 말에서 라시 용 마도 라시 뒤에 동상한테 통화마도 니 가사도 고고 말아 가사도 고고 말해 제자디 인자 가사 곧 로이페트 그 제바치는 통일도 갑래 로기 가르친 거라서 가사 랑 원이 뒤에 동바 동상지 통고를 마도 가사 그런 통고 말와 로디기 제가 동상이 마도 신 가야 통고 매 봐서 동바인데 매가래서 리메가 신매베 탕실라면도 로디기 가르 통고라서 신요 말때 탕두세 탕데 통고를 와 제가 디 많이 탕 많이 가래서 디 로이파 통나를 켜봐도 와 Gansa temper duper smarta, Gansa horon, Gansa lamna dubareje. Gansa labde Gansa horon go, but Gaza Gaya gab the Guminwaje.
So with the affirming negation, so a plane without trees, there what is negated is there are no trees, and it's implied or suggested that there is still the plane. So that's why it's an affirming negation. The illustration of the non-affirming negation is that the person is not inherently existent, or is empty of being inherently existent. All that appears to this consciousness is emptiness. So the consciousness realizing emptiness, which is the non-affirming negation, to that consciousness, all that appears is emptiness. So it stops there, right? It doesn't go further. All that appears to the consciousness realizing emptiness is the person, it's emptiness, yeah? Whereas with the affirming negation, when one hears the statement, a plane that has no trees, then you know there are no trees, but a plane is implied. So that appears to the consciousness. Whereas, again, to the wisdom that is realizing emptiness, only emptiness appears. And therefore emptiness is a non-affirming negation, because nothing else is implied. If you listen to last night's questions, this came up then in a different way, but it came up then too. Okay.
At death, is it better to take the next birth in the form realm, given that there is not the same suffering in the desire realm, to motivate us to leave samsara entirely?
So is it, at death, is it better to take rebirth in the form realm, even though there's not the same suffering as in the desire realm, which is required to motivate us to attain liberation?
지다 저기 냠린 제게 림비기다 직제바이나 아주 되비기에다 덴주기 루딘 토비아디 다 냠린 제야래 된 약쇼레스오라 된 약쇼레스 제산디 냠린 제게 된 약쇼레 제산디니 인자 된 약쇼인자 델야 다 튠긴로 상반에 아주 냠린 제게 되발기네 야가로 책으로와 나 가서네 디텐데라 나 저기 도당 아 니가 냠네 지야라고 그래서 아니 저기 강아 뭐보다 내중께 레라와레스다 그런 셰바나 진짜산 디네자 아니 디 뭔데고 봐 가스토야 될야 남유디 야가라 지고래 나 저기 다 지난 수컴을 깨봐나 최 냠네 제요래 타바침비기 최 냠네 제 차상 요래 바리 나가 냠네 제도 매바래 요 말에 제가 최 냠네 제요 이제 수컴을 깨봐나 되게 저게 저기 튕긴 당겨봐다 대 저기 나 냠내 제 가서 그래 태바 취 냠내 제 예대 봐서 나 수감 끼네 저기 야보책으로 와 이제다 딩이디다 지난 타지도 디야가래서 셰셔마 당가서 도당아 니가게 냠내 돈에 제바이나 다 니딘디 저기 미르딘 톱나 야가래서 아직 시고 뒤비 미르딘 톱고 그래서 그래 대주된 거 아니냐면 제가 말다 뇌도 아니냐면 제가래 진짜 태바침 비추 냐면 제 년뒤에 직 태바침 비추 냐면 자주 쌤 고비하다 자서 용거래 진짜 디디고래 다 대소소 대야가 두었으나 가서 소소 라라를 빠베게 대소소기 디지게 야도 차로 그러와 제 지찬에 맞아 냠는 제기 된 약쇼디다 약쇼디다 미니 인소를 되게 미된디 인소를 지담네 약쇼디에서
Here then, to answer your question, one should understand the benefits of both realms, of both places of rebirth, and then make a decision for oneself, which to aspire for. So certainly in general, one would say the very best rebirth, the very best of all that are possible, is to attain a precious human rebirth in the desire realm. This is sorry, I should have mentioned earlier. So I'm talking from the perspective of practitioners, so those who want to attain liberation or enlightenment. So the very best rebirth is a precious human rebirth in the desire realm that is marked by excellent conditions for spiritual practice. So this is seen as the very best because here one can comparatively easily develop definite emergence, and secondly, one can practice both Sutra and Tantra. So these are the reasons why it is said in general that for sincere practitioners, the very best rebirth to develop spiritually is to attain a precious human rebirth marked by excellent conditions within the desire realm. The advantage, though, of being born in the form realm is well, firstly, those who would aspire to be born in the form realm would be those of Mahira and solitary realizer lineage, as well as those of the Bodhisattva lineage. All types of Dharma are presented in the form realm, but only the sutra presentation is there, not the tantric presentation. So that's what's presented. Then it's for the individual to decide what they aspire for.
It's not clear out one way or the other.
Anisha?
I had this question. When we're talking about the non-affirming negation, what is the difference between a person who's meditating on emptiness and wrongly realizes nihilism, and someone who's focusing on non-affirming negation and realizes emptiness? Like, what's the difference between nihilism and actually realizing emptiness? Because we've been talking so much about habits of non-affirming negation, which kind of sounds like nothingness as well, like nihilism.
So maybe I can phrase it like this. So can Kela say something on the practitioners meditating on emptiness and recognizes that emptiness is a non-affirming negation? How does that differ from someone who is meditating on emptiness and comes to the conclusion that nothing exists, so the conclusion of nihilism?
Yeah.
Okay.
메가다 제단이 저부터 제가 말하는 제단은 가야 민도 섬섬시로와 지단 동반이 세디 가서 랑링을 랑신이 주변 동발이 동상시 자인데 shenla matyoba yomare sechi shenla matyoba gaya mebadi tugorwa tidu ane di jema de samdang yodo ane garli gorsan shenla dyene yore sechi gorwa go tugorwa cheda seti gaya yomare sechi sigurma to shenla dyene yomare matyoba iga yomare sechi gaya meba chagri sechi gorwa ta rangwen de tongba re la rang ngwen shenla matyoba jiye ba di tongba re la byedo shen ji due ne yongure se ji yo ba di shen le due ne yongure se di go go ro li go re jine inza ane di ding ji ba cha go ma le.
So the person who falls into the extreme of nihilism will come to the understanding that nothing exists at all. So this is the view of nihilism, that that nothing exists. Whereas the person who does correctly realize emptiness and thereby understands that emptiness is a non-affirming negation, to get there, they'll see that phenomena appear in a particular way, existing, being self-existent, but realize they are empty of existing in that way. So there is this process of negation when they realize emptiness, where nothing else is implied. Thereafter, though, they recognize that phenomena, though, still exist conventionally as dependent arisings. So that then is the additional step that it would be taken. So in this way, the two are actually very different.
So would you say, before they go into post-meditation, when they're just in that empty state, is that the same as nihilism then? Like if it requires the post-meditation to actually bring up the dependent arising aspect of it?
So whilst they are realizing emptiness, would that differ in any way at all from realizing nothingness or believing nothingness?
You don't have the post-meditation,
Yeah.
just in an empty state.
Okay.
The Tomani does a Kala Matuba Rang Wene to Badu, Mindu Samba Tonga Mato, Zawagini Mindu said Tongo Mara. She Kala Matuba di Mindu said Tongorwa. Kala Matuba Korong Wene to Badi Mindu said Tongo Mato, Meba Tongo Mare. Meba Tongo Mare. Just a mere Cheta Tona, Zawagini Kaya Mindu Samba Tongo Horwa. Digapso, Tombani Door to Kaya Mindu said Tongo Marwa. Rango Mwene, Gan Shenchila, Matioba Rangwene Jubadi Mindu said Tongo, Dini Meba in the Karwa. Chik the Rango Mwene, Shala Matioba Rangwene Juba, Meba said Jida, Meba said in the Karwa. Jida Meba, Bene, as Mijin Garzore, Rovadi in the Roa, Chisash, Kala, Matioba Korongwene Jubadi, Yomare said Dedang. So
if you take these two statements, this is how they would get to that realization or what they would understand, right? So the first would be relating to the person who is fallen into nihilism. Their statement is, it does not exist. It does not exist at all, right? The person who has realized emptiness does not exist in the way it appears. So that's quite different. It does not exist at all. It does not exist in the way that it appears. So in this way, they come to a different understanding. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.